We will now continue with the presentation by the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, which is PMD 14-P1.2D. Dr. Thompson, please proceed.
Good morning, Madam Chair and members of the Joint Review Panel. My name is Patty Thompson. Je suis la directrice générale de la direction de l'évaluation et de la protection environnementale et radiologique avec la Commission canadienne de sûreté nucléaire. With me today are Dr. Emandra Muley and Mr. Graham Smith, environmental risk assessors with the CNSC's Environmental Risk Assessment Division. In addition, other members of the CNSC staff's technical review team are available to answer questions. CNSC staff have reviewed OPG's submission of the methodology used to determine the significance of adverse environmental effects, as requested by the Joint Review Panel in Information Request EIS 12510. CNSC staff also submitted, as part of last year's hearings proceedings, a lengthy response to Undertaking Number 53 that outlined CNSC staff's assessment of significance of adverse environmental effects. Today's presentation summarizes CNSC staff's review presented in PMD 14P1.2. I will now ask Mr. Emandra Muley to continue with the presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Thompson. Good morning, Madam Chair, members of the Joint Review Panel. For the record, my name is Dr. Emandra Muley. I am an environmental risk assessment specialist at the CNSC. This presentation will cover the following topic areas: CNSC staff's previous assessment of the significance of residual adverse effects on the biophysical environment in Undertaking Number 53, the basis for CNSC staff's review of OPG's response to the information requests, as well as our methodology to assess significance as presented in Undertaking Number 53. An example of CNSC staff's analysis of the significance of adverse effects of the DGR project on the terrestrial environment. A discussion of OPG's response to information request EIS-12-510, and finally, the impact of this assessment on previous CNSC staff conclusions and recommendations for the EIS and the license to prepare the site and construct the proposed DGR. In PMD 13-P1.3, CNSC staff summarized our assessment of OPG's submission on the assessment of the significance of residual adverse effects on the biophysical environment and on Aboriginal interests as provided in the 2011 Environmental Impact Statement. Then, during the 2013 hearings, the panel requested in Undertaking Number 53 additional information on CNSC staff's evaluation of significance, including the methodology and criteria used in the assessment. The environmental aspects covered in CNSC staff's response to the undertaking included hydrology and surface water, aquatic environment, terrestrial environment, human health, and finally, radiation dose to non-human biota. Prior to the assessment of significance of residual adverse effects, CNSC staff reviewed the information submitted by OPG from the perspective of completeness, logical reasoning, and that the information was scientifically sound. Where information was lacking or needed further clarification, information requests were issued. OPG's responses to these information requests were reviewed by CNSC staff. CNSC staff used a number of methods to determine significance of residual adverse effects depending on the biophysical component of the environment being assessed. Staff did not rely on OPG's methods for determining significance. Staff used criteria outlined in the EIS guidelines issued in 2009. These criteria are magnitude, geographic extent, timing, duration, frequency, reversibility, ecological and social cultural context, and probability of occurrence. A weight of evidence approach was then used by CNSC staff to collectively consider the information provided for each of the significance criteria. In doing so, staff took into account uncertainties and used a precautionary approach. Documents, standards, guidance, and objectives used by CNSC staff for significance assessment are listed in the reference section of our response to undertaking number 53. These include relevant regulatory documents, environmental standards, guidance, and objectives published by federal, provincial, or international agencies. To assess potential effects of hazardous substances on human health, toxicity reference values were used by regulatory agencies such as Health Canada, U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, World Health Organization, or the Ontario Ministry of the Environment were used in the assessment. If applicable quantitative standards for a biophysical environmental component did not exist, then significance was determined using factors derived from the scientific literature, such as ecological function and the presence of unique features. In the environmental impact statement and through information requests, OPG identified 8 residual adverse effects for site preparation and construction and operations phases of the DGR project. These are found under hydrology, terrestrial environment, aquatic environment, noise and vibration, atmospheric environment, and aboriginal interests. In the EIS, OPG assessed the significance of these residual adverse effects using a decision tree approach along with the criteria outlined in the EIS guidelines. CNSC staff found OPG's approach to be acceptable. I will now pass on this presentation to Mr. Graham Smith to provide a detailed example of how CNSC staff determine significance.
For the record, my name is Graham Smith. I'm an Environmental Risk Assessment Officer with the CNSC. This portion of the presentation will discuss staff's determination of significance using the terrestrial environment as an example. I will first provide a brief summary of the residual adverse effect identified and will then present CNSC staff's use of the EIS criteria for making a significance determination. For the terrestrial environment, the EIS identified an adverse effect to eastern white cedar associated with the clearing of mixed woods forest within the DGR project area during site preparation and construction activities. The mixed forest vegetation community was represented by the eastern white cedar as a valued ecosystem component, or VEC, in the EIS because it is an abundant species in the local study area, indicating it is a good representative for local forests. It is slow-growing and plays an important role in providing habitat for wildlife, particularly in winter when it is a preferred food source of food and shelter by white-tailed deer and other wildlife. Also, as a conifer, it was considered potentially more susceptible to changes in air quality. Mitigation measures proposed by OPG included the retention of forest where possible and constructing exclusionary fencing around the project area to prevent further loss of species from adjacent habitats. However, the loss of 8.9 hectares of mixed wood forest could not be mitigated, and therefore this was identified as a residual adverse effect of the project. To assess the significance of the forest removal, staff evaluated the residual effect using the significance criteria provided in the EIS guidelines. As mentioned in a previous slide, these are magnitude, geographic extent, timing, duration, frequency, reversibility, ecological and social context, and the probability of occurrence. Firstly, the magnitude of the effect was evaluated. The importance of a given area of forest is highly site-specific, requiring consideration of a number of forest attributes. For this reason, a generic quantitative benchmark that would characterize the magnitude or amount of forest removal which may be considered significant was not available. In the absence of a quantitative benchmark regarding the magnitude of an effect, CNSC staff employed a weight of evidence approach using information provided by the proponent for each of the remaining EIS significance criteria, which I will now outline. Regarding the geographical extent criterion, the removal of mixed forest will be limited to within the DGR project area. As mentioned on a previous slide, an estimated 8.9 hectares will be cleared to make room for surface infrastructure. Within the site study area, or SSA, additional forests exist to the northeast and also to the south, which is where the largest on-site woodlands are located and which are contiguous with the forests of Inverhuron Provincial Park. Considering these additional forests, the 8.9 hectares amounts to approximately 11% of the mixed forest in the site study area. Also, primarily due to forest to the north of the site, including McGregor Point Provincial Park, the amount to be cleared represents less than 1% of the woodland in the local study area, or LSA. The timing, duration, and frequency are relatively straightforward for this effect. The forest clearing will commence during site preparation activities, and direct effects to eastern white cedars would be continuous throughout operations. Regarding the probability of occurrence criterion, although OPG has indicated the vegetation removal will be avoided where possible, the removal of 8.9 hectares will be required should the project be approved. For evaluating the reversibility criterion, CNSC staff acknowledged that the rehabilitation or site rehabilitation is planned for the DGR site during the decommissioning phase, and which includes plans for mixed forest regeneration. It is recognized, though, that it will take additional time before forests would be reestablished to their current state. Therefore, for the purposes of significance determination, this effect was treated as non-reversible by CNSC staff. As mentioned earlier, the value of a given forest or forest subset is highly dependent on site-specific attributes. These are considered primarily under the ecological context criterion. The 8.9 hectares of forest to be cleared do not contain features such as species composition, age, or habitats that would be considered unique to the local study area. The forest exists as 3 smaller forest parcels comprised of common regenerating species, and their ecological function is limited by their small size, fragmentation, and the high level of disturbance they are subjected to as a result of their location amongst the infrastructure of the Bruce Nuclear Power Plant and other on-site infrastructure. Habitat connectivity was considered under the ecological context criterion. The forest is used occasionally by wide-ranging wildlife species such as white-tailed deer and wild turkey. However, the ability of the forest in the DGR project area to function as meaningful habitat connections for bird and wildlife movement is severely limited by the presence of the existing Bruce Power facilities to the north, south, and to the west. Continuing with ecological context, the sustainability of eastern white cedar in the local study area will not be compromised. The 8.9 hectares of forest represents a very small proportion, less than 1%, of the mixed wood forest in the local study area. Therefore, the loss of this forest area was not considered critical to the sustainability of this vegetation community in the local area. Regarding the sustainability of bird and wildlife populations using the forests which are targeted to be cleared for the DGR project, the species which inhabit these forests are generally those that are tolerant of disturbance and fragmented forest habitat. Given the abundance of fragmented forest in the region, these are generally common species with healthy populations. Furthermore, due to their small size, these forest fragments do not provide the interior forest habitat that is preferred by many area-sensitive species. Therefore, removal of this low-quality habitat is not expected to have measurable impacts on local populations of bird and wildlife species. Considering the information provided by the proponent, the key points of which I have just outlined in this presentation, CNSC staff determined that the residual adverse effect on the terrestrial environment, namely the clearing of 8.9 hectares of mixed forest for the DGR project, is not likely to result in a significant adverse effect on the terrestrial environment, taking into account the implementation of mitigation measures. We hope that walking through this specific example provided a clear understanding of the methodology used by CNSC staff to determine the significance of adverse effects. I will now pass this presentation back to Dr. Hemender Moulier.
Thank you. Dr. Hamidra Moulier for the record. During the fall 2013 hearings, the panel asked OPG how the significance of adverse environmental effects was assessed for the DGR project. In response to the questions from the JRP during the hearings, OPG outlined the approach used for determining the significance of adverse effects in the EIS. Subsequently, the JRP requested, as part of information request package number 12, that OPG provide a detailed explanation of how the significance of each residual adverse effect on the biophysical environment and on Aboriginal interests was determined. The proponent's response to this information request was submitted to the JRP on March 28 of this year. CNSC staff completed and submitted a detailed sufficiency review of OPG's submission on June 6 of this year. Our review is available on the registry as entry number 1871. OPG's response to information request EIS-12-510 relied on a series of hypotheses or conditions for each residual effect. In order for a residual effect to be considered significant, any one of the conditions would need to be evaluated as true. OPG applied context-based reasoning as requested by the panel in the information request to make a determination regarding each hypothesis and ultimately arrived at a final significance determination. Each effect was also characterized using the EIS significance criteria discussed earlier. OPG's initial approach used in the 2011 EIS submission involved categorizing each effect under the various significance criteria and making a determination using a decision tree. OPG's conclusions using the hypothesis approach outlined in their response to EIS-12-510 were consistent with the significance determination made in the EIS. CNSC staff also reviewed OPG's approach and found the hypotheses used as well as the reasoning to be acceptable. Much of the reasoning used to assess each hypothesis was similar to that used by CNSC staff in response to undertaking number 53. CNSC staff had determined that the additional information and analysis provided by OPG in response to the information request have no impact on previous assessments presented in PMD 13-P1.3 for the environmental impact statement and PMD 13-P1.2 for the license application. On the basis of our independent assessment of all the information presented to support the EIS, CNSC staff continued to conclude that the DGR project is not likely to result in significant adverse effects on the environment, taking into account the implementation of mitigation measures and OPG's commitments. Staff also conclude that OPG is qualified and will make adequate provisions to protect persons and the environment as required under the Nuclear Safety and Control Act. This concludes CNSC staff's presentation. We are available to answer any questions.
Thank you.